How does Mexico's most powerful drug lord fall? Not because of an operation, not because of the DEA, but because of the women who loved him. For years, he was the most wanted man in Mexico, and he was betrayed by the two people who knew the most about him, the ones who slept under the same roof as him. There was a man who, for more than a decade, ruled from the shadows one of the most coveted territories in Mexico. A man who built an empire from absolute poverty, who outwitted the authorities of two countries for years, who became the #1 target of the most powerful security agencies in the world. A name that no one dared to say out loud. They called him El Mencho, and for years that name was synonymous with absolute power. But everything built on fear, on bought loyalty, and on secrets can also collapse for those same reasons, because power in organized crime is fragile in a way that is impossible to see from the outside. And the people you trust the most are sometimes the most dangerous. Not because they are bad, but because they are human. Today you will discover how Mexico's most wanted man began to lose his empire. Not from the outside, not through a spectacular operation broadcast live on screens around the world, not through the intelligence of some federal agency that finally came up with the missing piece of information, but from within, from his own bed, from the people who said they loved him, from the secrets he thought no one else knew. Stay until the end, because what you're going to hear about the betrayals that surrounded this kingpin, about the mistakes he made when he thought he was most protected, about the women who knew too much, and who eventually had enough reasons to use what they knew, is going to surprise you more than you imagine, and more than Mencho ever imagined. To understand what happened, you first have to understand who Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes was. That was his real name, a name that sounds like anything but what it would become. He was born in Mingtoquis Yus Oltmish Olti, in Tierra Caliente, a region of the state of Michoacán that seems to have been taken from a novel of the last century. Crushing heat, rugged terrain, communities where the state always arrived late or never arrived, where authority was a distant and abstract idea that people only knew by name. He grew up in misery, not as a metaphor but in real poverty, the kind that forces you from childhood to choose between studying or eating, between staying or leaving. Poverty that has no easy answers and leaves scars that money can cover but never completely erase. And Nemesio left. He emigrated to California, as did thousands of young Mexicans of his generation, looking for something that did not exist in their homeland. An opportunity. Any opportunity. He did all sorts of jobs in the United States. He was an agricultural day laborer. He worked in the strawberry and lettuce fields of Napa Valley. He lived among migrant communities who shared tiny rooms and big dreams. Men and women who sent money to their families, who saved every penny, who endured harsh conditions because they had a clear goal in mind. He was no different from hundreds of thousands of Mexicans who crossed the border in search of a decent future. But something changed, and that something has a name. An already established criminal network that operated in the counties of Northern California, a network that offered what honest work had never given him: quick money, hard-won respect, and a sense of belonging that the work fields never offered him. That network didn't actively seek out Nemesio. He found it. Or perhaps both things happened at the same time, at the precise moment when a person and a circumstance cross paths and change the course of everything. He was first arrested in the United States on charges related to the distribution of prohibited substances. He was prosecuted, he was deported, and when he returned to Mexico, he did not return as the day laborer who left. He returned with contacts, experience in the distribution networks of Northern California, a practical understanding of how the business worked, and an ambition that no one could afford anymore. What followed was the toughest school of organized crime in Mexico. Nemesio joined the cartels of the millennium, criminal structures that at that time dominated large territories of western Mexico. That's where he learned the trade, not the glamour that television series portray, but the real work of a criminal organization, the logistics of moving merchandise from one point to another without being detected, distribution in increasingly complex markets, handling money in quantities that require sophisticated financial structures, managing loyalties in an environment where disloyalty can cost lives, the administration of fear as a tool of control. He had something that few people in that world have: operational intelligence. He wasn't the most violent. He wasn't the one who shouted the most. He wasn't the one who boasted the most about his position. He was the one who thought the most. He was the one who observed before acting. He was the one who preferred planning to improvisation, patience to impulse. And in that environment, that made him more dangerous than anyone else. Eventually, his path crossed with the Sinaloa Federation, the most powerful criminal conglomerate in Mexico in the early years of the 21st century. He worked under some of the most feared names in the country, and in that process, he observed, learned the mechanisms of an organization that had reached that level of power, and waited for his moment. That moment arrived when the Federation began to fragment, when internal wars between factions left territories without control and structures without clear leadership, when opportunities for someone with vision and the right contacts opened up in a way that would not have been possible in times of stability. Nemesio wasted no time, along with his brother-in-law Abigail Gonzalez Valencia, and a group of men who were deeply loyal to him, who had walked with him through the difficult years, and who trusted in his leadership abilities. He founded what would become one of the most powerful and organized criminal groups in recent Mexican history. They called it the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or simply by its initials. The name was chosen with care. New generation was not just an empty phrase, it was a deliberate message. It was a declaration that things were not the same as before, that the old structures, the old rules, the old ways of operating were behind us, that something different had arrived, something more modern, something more efficient, something that was going to redefine the map of criminal power in Mexico. And it was different. While other criminal organizations operated with structures that were more or less known, more or less predictable in their internal logic, the CJNG adopted a strategy that combined aggressive territorial expansion with selective brutality and an ability to infiltrate institutions that left Mexican authorities without an effective response for years. The organization understood the importance of public messages, of propaganda, of building an image that would generate both terror in enemies and support in the communities where it operated. El Mencho, as he began to be called in the circles where his name was already beginning to resonate, was the architect of that strategy. His base of operations was in Jalisco, specifically in the metropolitan region of Guadalajara, the second largest city in Mexico, an urban environment completely different from the ranches and towns where he had grown up and where other organizations had their traditional roots. Operating from a large city offered advantages that others had not been able to exploit: anonymity, access to financial infrastructure, proximity to airports and seaports. A population so large that moving around in it without attracting attention was perfectly possible. From Jalisco, the CJNG began an expansion that was unprecedented in speed and geographic reach. In less than a decade, the group had a documented presence in more than 20 Mexican states, had international operations in more than 30 countries, and had alliances with criminal organizations in Asia, Europe, and South America. It had built distribution networks that reached markets where Mexican organized crime had not previously had such a structured presence. To understand the magnitude of this, imagine a company that opens offices in half the world in 10 years. Now imagine that this company does not sell legal products, and that each expansion involves fighting for territory against competitors who are willing to do anything to defend it. That each new market conquered requires convincing or defeating those who controlled it before. That each new structure that is built requires trustworthy people to manage it, money to finance it, and the kind of authority that is only exercised when everyone knows that disobeying you has consequences. That is what Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes built in the first half of the 2010s, and he did it while remaining almost invisible to the general public, to the media, to the world that did not live in the circles where his name meant something. While other criminal leaders appeared in photographs, gave interviews from ranches or estates, and moved around in convoys of armored vehicles that announced their presence from miles away, El Mencho operated in the shadows, changed his appearance several times, lost weight, grew a beard and then cut it off. He used different names and different identities in different contexts. He moved between safe houses, rotating them so frequently that tracking him was difficult. He limited to a minimum number the circle of people who knew where he was at any given time. He used modified satellite phones, encrypted communication systems, and intermediaries who never knew what part of the message they were transmitting. In technical terms, he was a ghost with power. And for years, that was exactly the case. Mexican federal agencies were looking for him. The DEA was looking for him. The U.S. Treasury Department issued sanctions against him, meaning that any person or entity doing business with him is automatically exposed to international legal consequences, which is a powerful tool for financially isolating an organization. The United States government even offered millions of dollars for information leading to his capture. Millions of dollars, a figure that most people will not see in their entire lifetime of honest work. And yet, nothing happened. While all this was happening, Nemesio was not living extravagantly, not in the way that popular imagination portrays criminal leaders, with mansions on the hills that everyone can see, with parties that last for days and attract the attention of the whole world, with collections of luxury cars that cruise through the main streets. He was more calculated. He lived well, yes, but discreetly. He owned scattered properties that were registered in the names of third parties. He had legitimate businesses that served as a front for his financial operations. He had people managing his money in ways that made it difficult to trace the origin of every peso, every dollar, every euro. But he also had something else. He had a family, a wife with whom he had built a life that, seen from the outside, might seem like that of any other family. He had children. He had the responsibilities and affections that all human beings have, regardless of what they do for a living. And although he didn't know it yet, he also had the beginning of his own destruction. Power has a shadow that few speak of frankly. The life of someone who commands a criminal organization of that scale is not just glamour and control, it is also permanent paranoia. The inability to trust anyone completely, even those closest to you. It is making decisions about the life and freedom of other people from a position of almost total isolation. It is sacrificing normality on the altar of power, year after year, until normal life becomes so distant that it almost seems like someone else's memory. Nemesio knew it better than anyone. He had lived for decades in that state of constant surveillance. And yet, like all human beings, he had needs that power alone could not satisfy. He had a need to be known in his entirety, not just as the boss who gives orders, but as the complex and contradictory person he was beneath the role he had assumed. Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia was his wife, a family woman, the mother of his children, a central figure in the social and family structure that El Mencho had built around him. Rosalinda was not a passive spectator of her husband's life. She was part of that life, in a way that went beyond simply sharing a home. She was part of the structures, part of the connections, part of the framework that sustained the daily functioning of that world. She knew who he was. She knew what he did. She knew how things worked. And for years, that implicit complicity was part of the fabric that held the private world of the drug lord together. But human relationships are complex, and the one that existed between Nemesio and Rosalinda was no exception. Decades of shared life in extreme conditions leave their mark, creating resentments that silently accumulate. They create emotional debts that are never paid off because, in that environment, nobody has the time or space to talk about what they really feel. What Mexican and American intelligence would begin to reconstruct over the years was that Rosalinda González Valencia was not only Mencho's wife, she was also someone who had her own interests, her own independent connections, her own ways of relating to the world of organized crime beyond her role as a spouse. She was, in her own right, an actor with her own agency in that environment. But that would come later. Before the story reached that point, there was another element that no one saw coming or dared to see. Because in that world, pointing out what shouldn't be pointed out can have consequences that no one wants to face. Because El Mencho also had a lover. It was allegedly the influencer Maria Julissa. Her full name has not been made fully public in the available investigations, but her existence has been confirmed in multiple court documents and intelligence reports. She was a woman with whom Nemesio had been having a parallel relationship for several years, a relationship he considered protected by his discretion, by the fear he inspired in those who knew about it, and by his own power to make any threat that arose from that situation disappear. A relationship that, like so many things in his life, he thought he could completely control. He was wrong. By Ikiming on Besh, the CJNG was impossible to ignore, not only because of its territorial expansion, which continued to advance at a pace that left the authorities always reacting from behind, unable to anticipate, only responding, but also because of a series of events that put the group in the headlines of the international media in a way that no criminal organization in Mexico had achieved in decades. On Birmay, Ikiming on Besh, a convoy of vehicles belonging to the Mexican Federal Police was ambushed in the municipality of Ocotlan in the state of Jalisco. It was an operation that left security analysts around the world speechless. Not because it was the first ambush against federal forces in Mexico. These types of events had precedents, but the way in which they were executed, with a coordination, weaponry, and tactics that revealed the level of military capability that the CJNG had reached. There were armored vehicles. There were groups operating simultaneously at different points. There was a logistics operation that required planning and resources that went far beyond what the authorities attributed to a criminal group. This was not an ordinary criminal group that had grown larger than normal. That was something different. Shortly after, in that same month, a video appeared on the internet that immediately went viral in Mexico and in countries where the issue of organized crime generates attention. In it, uniformed men with high-level equipment and sophisticated weaponry identified themselves as members of the CJNG and declared direct war against state forces, against rival groups, against anyone who dared to confront them. It was a declaration of power unprecedented in its form and scope. It was a direct provocation to the Mexican federal government, broadcast in real time to millions of people. And the man behind all that still hadn't appeared. He was still the name everyone mentioned, but no one had seen in person recently, the invisible architect of something that was becoming increasingly visible. The authorities responded with Operation Jalisco. Thousands of security forces were deployed in the state. There were dozens of arrests in different categories of the organization. Properties, vehicles, weapons, and financial resources were seized. The government presented the results as a significant success, but the main target, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, did not fall. Because? The answer is more complex than simply saying he was more cunning or faster. It was that, but it was also something else. He had something that the authorities took a while to fully understand. An information network was also built so that every significant movement of federal forces reached his ears before it could directly affect him. He had people inside the institutions. He had eyes in places the authorities never thought he'd open them. He had the ability to anticipate because he had access to information that should have been exclusive to the state, but he also had something more. He had a growing certainty that he was untouchable. And that certainty, that conviction that the power he had built was absolute and indestructible, began to make him careless in ways that at that moment he did not recognize as mistakes. Nobody does it. No one who is at that point of power can be viewed from the outside with enough objectivity to identify when confidence has crossed the line into arrogance. The first big mistake was not tactical. It was not operational. It was not a decision about security or about the structure of their organization. It was emotional when a man living in forced isolation, in constant paranoia, and under the pressure of maintaining an empire that requires incessant decisions, finds in a person the illusion of normality, of genuine affection, of a space where he can step down from the pedestal of power and simply be a human being with his own vulnerabilities. That man lowers his guard, not suddenly, not consciously, little by little, almost without realizing it, because the process is so gradual that each individual step seems reasonable, harmless. Mencho's lover represented that for him, a seemingly safe private space where the rules that governed all other aspects of his life seemed to be suspended, where conversations could be freer than in any other context, where information flowed in a way that in any other relationship he would never have allowed, because in any other relationship he would have maintained the guard that he had spent decades perfecting. The problem is that information has no loyalty. Information exists independently of the intentions of who possesses it and who has it. It also has the potential power to use it. What happened in the following years was a gradual but inexorable process of infiltration. It wasn't a grand cinematic betrayal, a moment where someone picked up the phone and called the FBI with a whole package of information. It was something more subtle and more devastating. Patterns of behavior that began to be observed by people who knew exactly what they meant. Movements that created traces, decisions that established routines that could be monitored. Intelligence agencies, both Mexican and American, had been accumulating information about El Mencho for years. They knew a great deal about his organization. They knew about his global operations, about his distribution routes, about his international financial structures. What they didn't know, what had been impossible to establish precisely, was exactly where he was, what his actual movements were, what his habits were, if he had any in his personal life. That changed when certain patterns in the private life of Mexico's most wanted man began to become visible to those who knew where to look. And they knew where to look because someone somewhere in the chain had pointed out where to direct their gaze. Rosalinda Gonzalez Valencia's wife had been under surveillance for a long time for multiple reasons that went beyond her relationship with El Mencho. The Gonzalez Valencia family had its own structures, its own operations, its own presence in organized crime that was independent of Nemesio's figure, although deeply intertwined with it. The Gonzalez Valencia brothers had formed their own organization known as the Queeness, which operated in parallel and in collaboration with the CJNG. It was a family and criminal alliance at the same time, the kind of structure where blood ties and business ties blend together until they become indistinguishable. But alliances, even those of blood, have their tensions, their moments of fracture, their points where individual interests diverge from collective interests. The investigations into those who were progressing independently, but with direct consequences for the safety of El Mencho. Because to investigate those involved, it was necessary to investigate their closest connections. And those connections inevitably led to Rosalinda. And Rosalinda, by the nature of her position, carried information about Nemesio. But there was something more, something that the investigations gradually revealed and that changed the way the authorities understood the internal dynamics of power in that environment. The relationship between El Mencho and his wife had begun to show signs of strain that were noticeable to those who looked for them. Not in public statements that do not exist in that world, not in visible confrontations that no actor in that environment can afford, but in patterns, in movements that were made independently when before they were coordinated, in decisions that no longer seemed to be consulted, in small signs that are only legible to those who know how to read that specific language. Rosalinda knew things. She knew too much. She had lived for decades alongside a man whose power was all-encompassing, but who also imposed living conditions that were, in many ways, a form of control over everyone around him, including her. And she also knew about the mistress. That was no secret that Nemesio could completely keep from someone who had known him for so long and who had his own eyes and ears in the same world he inhabited. What is a woman with that knowledge doing in that environment? What options does someone have who knows that the world they live in is beginning to collapse, and that their position within that world depends on the solidity of the one who built it? These are questions for which there are no simple answers. But the actions that followed began to sketch an answer as this was happening inside Mencho's private world. Outside, the pressures on the CJNG had not decreased. On the contrary, they had increased in ways that are sometimes difficult to see in real time, but which are evident in retrospect. The Mexican government, under increasingly intense international pressure, and with new administrations that brought their own commitments and strategies, had intensified its operations against the organization. But capturing El Mencho still seemed to be something that was always just a step away, always just out of reach, as if there were a minimum distance impossible to close. In Iqui Ming Yagirma, his son Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, was captured. His legal process progressed until he was eventually handed over to the United States authorities, where he faced charges related to trafficking prohibited substances with characteristics that allowed for extradition, that is, his transfer to the jurisdiction of another country to be tried there. The capture of his son was a blow that operated on multiple levels simultaneously. It was first an emotional blow from which one does not easily recover, because no parent is fully prepared to see their child in that position, regardless of the world they both live in. Secondly, it was an operational sign that the shield he had created around himself had real cracks. And thirdly, it was a warning that the untouchability he had believed he had for so long was an illusion that time was eroding. How had the authorities managed to locate and capture someone so close to the leader? The answers to those questions when they arrived were more complex and more disturbing than any outside observer would have anticipated. Because the answer, at least in part, had to do with the same internal fractures that had begun to appear at the core of El Mencho's power. The same cracks that Mencho himself couldn't fully see because he was too far inside to have any perspective. The same cracks that the people around had decided to use for their own purposes. In a few minutes, you will discover the specific error that opened the final door to the fall. The mistake that Mencho didn't see coming because it came from where he least expected it. But first, you need to understand the context of the investigations that converged from multiple directions at the same time, because that convergence is what makes this case different from others. The DEA had spent years building a mosaic of information about CJNG. It wasn't a complete mosaic. It had gaps. It had shadow areas that resisted all attempts to illuminate them. But it was detailed enough to understand the power structures, the financial flows, the operating routes, the names of the main actors at each level of the organization. What was missing were the most intimate details, those that could only come from someone very close to the center, those that technical intelligence, financial analysis, and conventional operations could not provide because they belonged to the interior of a private life that Mexico's most wanted man had protected with almost perfect efficiency. Those details began to arrive, not from a single informant who made a dramatic decision in a moment of revelation, not from a deserter who arrived at an embassy with documents and a deal already negotiated, but from multiple sources, at multiple times, that began to build a coherent picture of something the authorities had been looking for from the beginning. Where did El Mencho live during each period? How did he move between locations? What were his habits when he let his guard down? At what times and in what places was it most predictable? The existence of the lover, known only to a very narrow circle within the organization, turned out to be an access point that no one had seriously considered until someone pointed it out, not because she herself made the decision to collaborate with the authorities directly and deliberately from the outset, but because his existence and the movements it implied for Nemesio created patterns, created routines, and patterns and routines in the world of intelligence are the key to everything. Because chaos can survive almost anything, but patterns can be read, anticipated, and eventually exploited. Every time Nemesio visited her, there were movements in her security structure, changes that individually might seem random, but which accumulated over weeks and months began to reveal a logic. Communications that generated traces even when encrypted. People who moved around and left footprints that someone with sufficient resources and time could follow. Those traces, accumulated over months, eventually drew a map that someone at some point decided to share with those who had the power and resources to use it. The question everyone asks when they hear this story is always the same. Why? Why someone so close to El Mencho? Someone who lived under his protection and depended on his structure to survive in a world where survival is not guaranteed for anyone, would take the risk of leaking information about him. There are multiple possible answers, and they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, in the most powerful cases of betrayal, several reasons operate simultaneously, reinforcing each other until the decision that seemed impossible becomes the only one that makes sense. The first reason is the most obvious: money. The rewards offered by the Mexican and U.S. governments for information leading to the capture of El Mencho were enormous. Millions of dollars on the American side, significant amounts on the Mexican side, plus a commitment to protection and relocation for anyone who provided useful information. For someone who lived inside that world and understood the true value of the information he possessed, those figures represented an escape, a different life somewhere else, with another name, with the possibility of starting from scratch. The second reason is fear. Not the generic fear that everyone experiences in that environment, but the specific fear of someone who feels that their personal position has become precarious. Internal purges in criminal organizations are real and frequent. Suspicion can fall on anyone at any time for any reason, real or imagined. Someone who perceives signs that their loyalty is being questioned, that their usefulness to the organization is decreasing, that they could become more of a problem than an asset, may make the decision to move first before being moved. The third reason, and perhaps the most powerful in this particular case, is accumulated personal resentment. Human relationships are complicated, even or especially in extreme environments. A lover who at some point discovers that her position is more fragile than she believed, that the power that protected her has its own limits and its own fragilities. A wife who has accumulated years of silent resentment, who has seen her own agency diminished by the shadow of a man whose power is all-encompassing, but who also controls everything. People who have given up fundamental aspects of their lives and who feel that what they receive in return is not proportional to what they have sacrificed. In the most powerful cases, these reasons do not operate alone. They combine in proportions that vary from person to person. And when that happens, the decision to leak information does not appear in the mind of the person who perceives it as an act of betrayal. It appears as a survival decision, as a choice between staying in an increasingly dangerous and uncertain world or using what is known to build a way out before the way out ceases to exist. What Mencho didn't know was that he was already being observed with a level of detail that the agencies searching for him had never achieved before. The authorities had information about their movements with a frequency that would have been impossible to achieve with technical surveillance alone. They had information about his medical routines because Nemesio suffered from health conditions that made him dependent on certain treatments that required access to people with specific medical knowledge and supplies that had to come from outside the places where he was hiding. They had information about the people he met with and how often. In short, they had a profile of his daily life that would have been impossible to construct without someone very close to him. Someone who knew him not as the untouchable boss, but as a human being with his routines and vulnerabilities. Coordination between Mexican and U.S. agencies had improved significantly compared to previous years. It wasn't perfect. No interinstitutional coordination between two countries with their own interests and political dynamics is ideal, but it was effective enough to allow information from multiple sources to be integrated and analyzed in relatively real time. The analysts worked with all that material in teams that sometimes didn't know each other, handling pieces of the puzzle without seeing the complete picture. To minimize the risk of the information reaching the wrong ears, they built predictive models, identifying patterns that repeated regularly enough to be significant. They were trying to anticipate where Nemesio would be, not today, but in the coming days, next week, next month, and each time the image became clearer. The years Iki Ming Yagirma and Iki Ming Yagirma beer were particularly complex for CJNG and its leadership. The pandemic had disrupted global economic structures, including those of organized crime, international movement routes, money flows, consumption patterns in markets, and supply chains that had been functioning for years with a fluidity that seemed guaranteed. Everything had changed quickly, and in a way that was difficult for any organization to anticipate. But the pandemic had also brought something unexpected for the CJNG, a public visibility that Nemesio had never sought for his organization, and that was exactly the kind of exposure that his shadow strategy had tried to avoid all those years. The CJNG had begun distributing food supplies and aid in communities during the first months of the pandemic. In times when the government was slow to respond and people needed immediate help, it was a well-known tactic in Latin American organized crime. Create narratives of community support that generate popular loyalty, hinder cooperation between the population and the authorities, and build an image of protectors in the places where they operate. It was an effective tactic, but it was also a tactic that required a public presence, that required the group's brand to be visible, that required exactly the kind of exposure that Nemesio had avoided his entire personal life. It wasn't Mencho who made those decisions directly, but it was he who allowed them. And that permissiveness revealed something about the state of the organization at that time, perhaps an overconfidence that the situation was under control. Perhaps the cumulative effect of years of impunity had created the illusion that the power that had been built was now so great that it could afford certain risks that previously would have been immediately dismissed. That's the kind of mistake you can only see in hindsight. At the time it happens, it doesn't seem like a mistake, it seems like a decision. While it seemed like a reasoned adaptation to the circumstances, from the outside, from the cold perspective of those who were observing it, it was an unequivocal sign that something had changed in the organization's security culture. The investigations into Rosalinda González Valencia had progressed to a point that the authorities considered sufficient to act. In Iki Ming Yigirma Iki, she was arrested in an operation that authorities described as the result of a long investigation process. The arrest of Mencho's wife was in itself an operation that required careful preparation. Not only because Rosalinda had her own security measures in place, because a woman in her position could not afford to be unprotected, but also because it was necessary to ensure that her arrest did not immediately alert Nemesio and give him time to react before the authorities could take advantage of the moment. The arrest occurred. Rosalinda González Valencia was placed at the disposal of the authorities, and a judicial process began that promised to be revealing in multiple ways. Because she was not only the wife of Mexico's most wanted man, she was also, in her own right, a figure with deep knowledge of the CJNG's financial structures, the names and connections of key people in the organization, and information about the group's inner workings that no intelligence agency fully possessed. For El Mencho, the arrest of his wife was more than just a strategic blow. It was something that operated at the most personal and intimate level possible. It was a sign that the world he had so carefully built over decades, the world that was supposed to be protected by layers and layers of security, loyalties, fear, and money, was crumbling from within. And the most disturbing thing was that he didn't know exactly how it had happened. He didn't know who had spoken first. He didn't know how much the various people who were being investigated at that time or were already in the hands of the authorities had revealed. He didn't know if the chain of betrayals had stopped with Rosalinda or if it was still moving towards him, closing the net. But who really betrayed him? It was the wife who spoke, motivated by her own interests or by the accumulated resentment of years of living in that environment. It was the lover who revealed key information about his movements, consciously or not, through channels that she herself may not have fully understood. It was both of them, for separate reasons, and perhaps without one knowing what the other was doing. Or was it someone else within the organization? Someone who used the chaos generated by these personal situations to act in his own interest? The answer, as is often the case in the most complex and human situations, is that the truth is more complicated than any of those versions taken separately. What the investigations gradually revealed was that there was no single moment of betrayal, but rather an accumulation of small leaks, decisions made by different people at different times and for different reasons, that converged to create the complete picture that the authorities needed to act effectively. The lover had revealed, consciously or unconsciously, patterns of behavior in Nemesio that would otherwise have been impossible to detect. His very existence was a vulnerability in the drug lord's security structure, because his visits created predictable movements in a context that was supposed to be completely unpredictable. Rosalinda, for her part, had made her own decisions when circumstances presented them to her. Decades of living in that environment had given her a deep understanding of how things work when they start to fall apart. And also, The understanding that in that world, the speed at which you move when the ship starts to sink determines whether you manage to get out in time or whether you go down with it. And within the organization, as always happens when the top begins to falter in ways that are perceptible to those who are attentive, actors began to emerge who saw an opportunity in the situation. People who had waited years for something to change. People who had their own ambitions and who understood that moments of crisis are also moments when power is reconfigured. What none of them knew precisely, and what none of them could fully control, was how all that information was being processed, integrated, and turned into strategy by the agencies that had been waiting for years for exactly this kind of crack in the wall. Mencho's health had been a factor that the authorities monitored with particular interest for years, because they understood it to be one of his most significant points of vulnerability. It was known to suffer from chronic conditions that required regular medical attention, including treatments that could not simply be abandoned or replaced by informal alternatives without serious consequences for his well-being. These medical needs were, paradoxically, one of his greatest points of vulnerability, because they involved travel to places where he could receive that type of care, contact with people in the medical world who were not necessarily part of his regular security structure, and dependence on supplies that had to arrive from the outside through chains of people. For someone who had built his security on total unpredictability, on the absence of fixed routines, on the ability to appear and disappear without leaving a trace, medical needs imposed a structure that could not be completely avoided without paying a price in terms of his own health. The authorities knew this, and it gave them a tool they had learned to use patiently, following the trail of medical supplies, the people who obtained them, the places where those people moved, gradually building a map of access to Mencho's immediate surroundings. Following that chain was, according to reports that have gradually emerged from the investigations, one of the threads that the agencies pulled most carefully and consistently, because that thread led to people, and those people led to places, and those places eventually connected with others that drew an increasingly complete picture. It wasn't fast-paced, it wasn't cinematic, it wasn't what you see in action series where everything is resolved in 90 minutes with dramatic revelation moments and high-octane chases. It was patient, meticulous intelligence work, coordinated between multiple agencies in multiple countries, accumulating information for months, discarding what was useless, building on what was useful, waiting for the moment when the elements aligned favorably enough. The revelations that emerged as the investigations progressed painted a picture that went far beyond the internal dynamics of the CJNG as a criminal organization. They revealed connections that explained why this organization had been able to operate with such effectiveness and impunity for so long. The infiltration of state institutions was deeper and more widespread than had been publicly acknowledged, not only at the lowest levels of the institutional chain, where corruption is endemic in contexts of low remuneration and high-risk exposure, but at levels that would have been difficult to imagine before investigations revealed them with sufficient evidence to be prosecutable. Officials with access to sensitive information about planned operations, people in strategic positions that allowed them to anticipate actions by the security forces before they were carried out. Individuals who for years had been paid to keep the CJNG one step ahead of those who pursued it, turning the advantage of anticipation into the group's main defense against state operations. Dismantling that network of complicity was as important and, in many ways, as difficult as capturing the group's leaders, because without that network, the organization lost something that money and force could not replace: the ability to anticipate, to prepare, to move before the danger arrived. And with the information that came from inside different sectors, the authorities were able to identify one by one those points of penetration. The process was slow for both technical and political reasons, but the process moved forward, and each point of penetration further weakened the ability of the CJNG and Mencho to receive early warnings that had been their shield for years. The consequences of this entire process were felt in multiple ways in the structure of the CJNG, in the map of organized crime in Mexico, and in the lives of millions of people who never chose to live near that world, but who do not have the option of choosing not to. The organization did not collapse. It would be inaccurate and also simplistic to say that the weakening of the leadership meant the end of the group. Criminal organizations of that magnitude have an extraordinary resilience that distinguishes them from other structures. They have decentralized structures that allow local cells to continue operating even when central management is compromised or under pressure. They have financial reserves that are in amounts that make operational continuity possible for years, even under adverse conditions. They have networks of relationships that do not disappear because a leader falls or weakens. What did happen was a reconfiguration of power that had already begun to take shape even before the pressures on Mencho reached their most intense point. Figures who had been in secondary positions within the organizational chart began to gain prominence. Regional leaders who had operated with relative autonomy under the coordination of the central structure saw in the situation of uncertainty an opportunity to consolidate their own authority within the territories they controlled. And with that consolidation inevitably came new tensions and new disputes that added another layer of instability to an already complicated panorama. In some territories, the weakening of central coordination opened up spaces that were exploited by other criminal groups that had been waiting for exactly that kind of moment. And that exploitation generated the kinds of consequences that in that environment are always measured in terms of violence, displacement of populations, of entire communities that are trapped in the middle of disputes that are not theirs. That is the real legacy of a power like the one El Mencho built, not the narrative of rise and fall, which has a cinematic drama that can be almost attractive if one does not think about its real consequences, but the persistent and diffuse structural damage that extends far beyond the individual, affecting communities that never had anything to do with the decisions of the criminal leaders, and that pay the price of those decisions for years or decades, which El Mencho could not control. Despite all their power, it was something that no human being can completely control the decisions of other people, especially when those people have their own reasons for making decisions that go against the interests of the one who believed they had them under their control. Absolute power in organized crime always has an expiration date, not because the state is always smarter or more efficient, not because intelligence technology always ends up winning, but because empires built on fear and secrecy are, in their deepest nature, fragile, because they depend on everyone who knows keeping quiet, and remaining silent indefinitely under increasing pressure, with ever more powerful reasons not to, is something few human beings can sustain. The story of El Mencho was not over yet at the time this documentary was produced. It is still ongoing. The investigations are ongoing. The agencies searching for him have not withdrawn the reward nor lessened the intensity of their attention. But the trajectory of his power has already left lessons that go far beyond the specific details of this case. About the price of power built on coercion. About the personal and human cost of living a life based on secrecy and everyone's fear of everyone else. About the impossibility of buying true loyalty, the kind that withstands time, pressure, and temptations. About the certainty that no one, absolutely no one, is untouchable forever. Today we understand the downfall of Mexico's most wanted man, not as the triumph of a security strategy or the failure of a criminal organization, but as something much more fundamental. Confirmation that human beings, ultimately, cannot be completely controlled, not even by fear, not even by money, not even by someone who for years seemed to have all the power in the world. The betrayal that brought down El Mencho came from where the most devastating betrayals always come from within. From the people who slept under the same roof as him, from the people who knew him better than anyone, from the people who in his world should have been the last to find reasons to act against him. And that is, ultimately, the mistake that no kingpin has been able to avoid throughout the history of organized crime in Mexico and the world. Believing that the power you exert over others is enough to neutralize their humanity, to erase their own desires, their own fears, their own resentments, to turn them into pieces on a board that you completely control. Nobody has been able to do that. Nobody will be able to do it. And as long as that remains true, the cycle will continue. In the world of power, without limits, without institutions to contain it, without possible accountability, the most dangerous enemy is not outside. It has always been inside. And sooner or later, everything that cannot withstand the light ends up being exposed by it.